Hey everyone, welcome to the CyberHub Engage podcast. I'm your host. My name is James Azar. Thanks for tuning in. If this is your first time listening to the CyberHub Engage podcast, this podcast is all about cybersecurity, data privacy, in layman terms, giving it simple takeaways for your everyday life. And we've got a great show planned for you today. So before we get talking about our show, just want to let you know you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn at CyberHub Engage. We'd love to get some feedback, love to interact with our listeners. And so when you get a chance or while you're listening now, and if you're not driving, just give us a like or a follow. We'd greatly appreciate it. Today's episode is going to be great. We have Patrick Gaul from the NTSC here in our studio, and we're really excited to bring him in. So without wasting any more time, and I did want to talk to you guys about my the breach that happened with my heritage. But we will leave that for our next episode. And this one, I'm just excited to get Patrick in here. So we'll go right to a quick break, and then we'll be right back with Patrick Gaul. So just stay tuned. We'll be back in 15 seconds. The CyberHub Engage podcast is brought to you by CyberHub Summit. CyberHub Summit is the leading executive cybersecurity education forum, hosting their second annual event in Atlanta, Georgia on October 10th. You can find out more at cyberhubsummit.com. Hey everyone, and we're back with the CyberHub Engage podcast. I'm in the studio with Mr. Patrick Gaul. Welcome.
Well, thank you for inviting me, James.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Patrick is with the NTSC, and I'll let you tell us a little bit. I know everything about the NTSC. I'm your biggest proponent and fan, but I'll let you tell our guests all about it.
Great. The NTSC, the National Technology Security Coalition, headquartered here in Atlanta, is a coalition of chief information security officers. We're a nonprofit 501c6. Our mission, simply stated, is to become the preeminent advocacy voice for the chief information security officer in Washington, D.C. We're doing that by amassing a board of directors from Fortune 1000 companies from across the nation. Even though we're headquartered in Atlanta, we do want it to be a national organization. So we have board members from Chicago, from New York, from California, Florida, South Carolina, all across the nation. We've broken the country down into 6 regions. We want 10 CISOs from each region. So ultimately, we'll have 60 on our board of directors. Today we have 32. I think we'll be at 40 by the end of June. And then there's another 7 or 8 that are also in the queue. So we should be at 60 by the end of this year. We have an advisory board that's comprised of senior executives, senior technology security executives from the solution providers that surround the CISO. So IBM Security, Juniper Networks, Core Security, Ionic Security, Signal Sciences, Webroot. And again, all of these folks on the advisory board are senior technology executives. And then we have a policy council that's comprised of governmental affairs executives from our board members, plus some of the top cyber lawyers in the country, like Sean Tuma from Sheaf and Stone, Roy Hadley, who's local here in Atlanta. And they help us form our legislative agenda and help us think through the policies and the issues that we're focused on. So that's the composition of the organization. And again, the focus is advocacy. The other side of that is we act as a bridge to try and bring together public and private stakeholders. So we work with DHS, we work with other federal agencies to try and bring the private sector perspective to the table, but at the same time trying to represent the public sector perspective as well, because sometimes DHS is not completely understood. Right. And there's misinformation out there.
Right. I mean, it's you guys are essentially the bridge and the voice of reason when it comes to talking to our elected officials on the Hill. You guys have the right agenda in mind when you're talking to them, correct?
We do. And unfortunately, excuse me, a little frog in my throat. Unfortunately, they're not always as cyber astute as we'd like to think they are.
Right.
There are some congressional leaders like Mike McCall from Texas and Mark Warner from Virginia, Lucan Myers, Tom Graves from here in Georgia. There are some representatives who really understand the cybersecurity issues, but for a lot of them, it's vague.
They look at it as a national defense issue. Do they? I mean, is that how do you perceive the officials who aren't really well informed about cyber? Where do you see them kind of point the finger when it comes to cyber?
Well, I think part of the challenge is a lot of times they point the finger at the company. I mean, at the end of the day, for all of the bad publicity that Equifax got, let's start with the premise that Equifax was a victim of a crime.
Correct.
Let's start there. I mean, you can argue how they managed it, but the reality is they were a victim of a crime. If I were to put a fence around my house and an alarm system on my house and somebody breaks in, the cops that come to my house aren't going to look at me as if I'm the criminal. They're going to look at me as a victim. And yet our companies are building all of these security measures in order to protect their companies, and then they get breached. And yet some federal officials, whether it's the FBI or the CIA, et cetera, will approach them as if they're the people who've done something wrong. So we really need to change that ethos and paradigm.
I'm writing down Equifax was the victim of the crime because of everyone who I've done this podcast with. You're the first to come in here and actually make a very valid point. Regardless of how they reacted, regardless of the aftermath of that breach, they were still a victim of a crime. A group of criminals decided to take advantage of that company, period, and break down a barrier. Do you feel like, and I kind of say this, do you feel like the federal government should be taking a hands-off approach to this, or should they be more hands-on? And if so, where would we start with where should the federal government start looking at cyber? Because there's proponents for federal government legislation, and there's people who say, hey, they can't get anything right. We don't want them even touching this subject because they could make it worse.
Well, I think you have to break it down into some components, James. There's notification, which is a huge issue,
right.
And constantly being brought up by various legislators.
Just a second here. Isn't that, though, on a state level right now? Isn't notification laws like every state has its own notification system, but there's no one federal notification
With
law?
Alabama and South Dakota just recently passing legislation, data breach notification legislation, we now have 50 states plus 4 territories, which is Guam, the Virgin Islands, District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. So we have 4 territories and we have 50 states. So if you're if you're McDonald's or Dollar Tree with 20,000 stores across the nation, and you get breached, you have to deal with the Attorney General in all 50 states. So we've created this notification industry, if you will, which doesn't do anything to enhance the protection of consumers, and it doesn't do anything to improve the security of the companies. We're spending all this money on telemarketing centers and on mailing letters and on creating websites for notification. And yes, we want consumers to be protected, but they're not equally protected under the current environment. So that under the breach we talked about earlier, a consumer in Georgia did not have the same level of protection as a consumer in Massachusetts or California or Rhode Island, which are the 3 toughest states when it comes to notification. So we advocate for federal legislation, for national data breach notification legislation that preempts all of the state legislation. As one of my chief information security officers said it recently, he said, set the bar as high as you want, but give us one place to file. So remove all of this administrative burden. Now, state attorney generals will tell you that they're the best arbiter of what's right for their consumers, and I get that. But we can't continue down this path with this hodgepodge.
Well, it's costly, isn't it? I mean, if you have to deal with 50 notifications for 50 states, I'm assuming that just the execution cost of that is tremendous for a company. So now they've been breached. They have to notify. Now they're spending a lot of money trying to comply with every notification law that's different. So that only adds to the burden of the cost.
Yeah, and if you look at the total cost of a breach, you see varying figures, but I saw one figure that up to 60% of the cost of a breach are in notification. I think that came out of the Ponemon Institute. I don't know if it's that high for every breach, but that was based on a study they did. So you've got all of these notification costs, but we're paying lawyers in each of those states, and then just the cost to continue to track the changing, because these aren't static notification laws. States are changing their laws all the time. They'll change their safe harbor provisions. If your data was encrypted, then you weren't breached. Well, now, yeah, even if your data was encrypted, you were breached. And so you have to spend money just tracking the notification laws to make sure you stay compliant. And we have a saying in the NTSC, compliance doesn't equal security.
Right.
Yeah, there are overlaps, sure. But just because you're compliant doesn't mean you're secure. So that's one component is the breach notification. The other side of the conversation has to do with, what's the private sector's role versus the federal government's role in data security? Because, at the end of the day, if you think about the cybersphere, the cyberspace, the vast majority of that is owned, operated, and maintained by the private sector. So the private sector, certainly when it comes to critical infrastructure in the United States, 90% of all the critical infrastructure, oil, gas, electricity, is owned, operated, and maintained by the private sector. So should the federal government have a role in trying to protect that infrastructure? Well, certainly Cyber Command does. U.S. Cyber Command has a role in critical infrastructure. But what if I'm a Fortune 1000 company and I get breached by a nation state? Do I want U.S. Cyber Command to come in and work with me to try and figure out what happened? Do I want U.S. Cyber Command proactively protecting me? And that conversation is certainly surfacing in this country today. I mean, if you look at U.S. Cyber Command's recently released revised vision statement, it portends a lot more offensive posture than they've had before. The whole, infrastructure has been governed by this doctrine of restraint that came out of a 2015 DoD strategy paper that basically said restraint.
Right.
But if you look at some of the comments that Secretary Nielsen made at RSA,
Right.
She said, if you're a nation state and you're intruding, get ready, because we're not going to just sit idly by and let you continue to do that. If you listen to the confirmation hearings for General Nakasone, he portends a very strong offensive posture. If we now, all 133 mission teams in U.S. Cyber Command are now fully operational. They're combat operational. So, and that's happened in 3 years. If you think about it, we've built those teams. We've trained over 7,000 service people, and that's joint. That's Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps. And I think about half of those teams are offensive and about half of those teams are defensive. But they're fully combat operational now, and they're out there protecting us. So I think the government's role in deterrence is something that we have to have a conversation about. Some of my CISOs would embrace U.S. Cyber Command helping them. Some of them would say, no, I don't really want U.S. Cyber Command in my knickers. I don't want them crawling around my infrastructure.
If you're a global company, which most of the companies on the NTSC board are, having U.S. Cyber Command could impact your global posture, because you'd look like you're almost in bed with, the U.S. government in terms of your security. Wouldn't that be the case? Couldn't that be a perception?
Yeah, I mean, the concept is that, you would militarize the internet,
Right.
the global internet. But the reality is the global internet is militarized today.
Right.
The Russians are doing it. The Chinese are doing it. The North Koreans are doing it. The Iranians are doing it. It's militarized today. So the idea that U.S. Cyber Command is going to lean forward and engage the enemy on the edge, I think makes a lot of sense. And the more aggressive we get, deterrence only works if somebody thinks there's consequences.
Right.
I mean,
so far, there hasn't been any.
There haven't been any consequences.
Yeah.
I mean, MAD worked because everybody knew that it was mutually assured destruction. But, if you've got all of this asymmetrical players, some of them backed by nation states. I mean, North Korea has players laying around everywhere working on attacking, and they're North Korean. They have a quota that they have to hit every month.
Well, Eastern Europe is compromised of companies. How you and I go to work and we walk into our office, companies that are just hackers, that their whole job is they're hired by the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, or anyone else, for that matter, the Iranians, to breach companies, to achieve a goal, to do a piece of a puzzle in a overall general attack plan or strategy to distract.
Well, and that's true. And there are some folks within the federal government who are advocating for private companies being more proactive in defending themselves. We have the Congressman Graves had his Active Cyber Defense Certainty Act, the ACDC Act, which is still on the books. And his idea was that we need to make it easier for companies to defend themselves. So things like beaconing, dark web hunting. There's a great paper that came out of George Washington University called Into the Gray Zone. And in that paper, they have a continuum of cyber defense tactics that range from, honeypots, pretty innocuous stuff, all the way up to rescue missions and botnet takedowns, right?
Right.
Most CISOs will tell you they don't want to go anywhere near the right side of that spectrum because they're not going to do botnet takedowns. They're not going to do rescue missions. On the left side, they're already doing honeypots and they're doing some other things. There was some legislative ambiguity around beaconing and around dark web hunting. And working with Congressman Graves, I think we were able to put some language into the legislation that we recommended that gives the CISOs a little more protection on those two areas. But most CISOs don't want to fight the PLA, the People's Liberation Army.
Right.
They would rather see the federal government protecting us.
Your focus is on your business.
Right.
You don't want to be fighting. I mean, as any company going against a nation state, you're limited by your resources. I mean, no matter what kind of company you are, you can do 150 billion a year in revenue. Still doesn't matter. You're still limited by resources when it comes to a nation state trying to achieve a goal.
And they're very patient. And they have a lot of resources.
That's the game of that's the challenge that our businesses face today. I mean, it's we're hearing all these different trade talks, but we won't get into that piece of it. But that does take us to this little piece, right? So GDPR, kind of a data privacy rule in Europe that really impacts any company that wants to work in Europe and so forth. Is GDPR something we need in the States? Or something similar to it, maybe?
I think we need federal legislation that mandates a certain level of protection based on the size of your company and your resources, that mandates a level of protection that's equal for all consumers across the country. But I think we also have to be practical. I mean, GDPR has 72-hour notification requirement. From the time you ascertain the data's been exfiltrated, you have 72 hours to notify the consumer. That's impractical. I mean, does anybody really understand what it takes to set up a notification mechanism to begin with? Okay, so I know data's been exfiltrated. Whose data was exfiltrated? Which consumers are impacted? How long do I have? There's got to be some period of forensics that allows me to figure all that out. And then, yes, I should notify my consumers as expeditiously as possible. But 72 hours is impractical, and it's not going to work in this country with the notification infrastructure that we've created. But I want to go back to something you said about trade talks. There are some things that that are cyber related. If you think about pulling out of the Iran deal, right decision, wrong decision, but it could result in more cyber activity by Iran.
It's already there. I mean,
more.
I was looking at the dark web report last night through a few different sources, and they're already seeing an uptick in chatter and kind of stuff going on that the Iranians are trying to do, especially considering the fact that the Russians have taken a posture in me in Middle East. That's just, my backyard and forte.
Right.
But there's already a backyard and chatter that the Russians are trying to get the Iranians out of Syria as well. And so there's now, which were once allies in supporting Assad, now they're kind of those allies, which is the Russians and the Iranians, are kind of at odds because the Russians want him out, because the Russians want to really secure an Air Force base in Syria and keep their port, but realizing that if Iran keeps doing what it's doing and Israel keeps doing what it's doing, there's eventually Assad will get toppled, because eventually Israel, I think, what was it? In one night, they destroyed 56 Iranian military installations and bases across Syria the night they launched 20 missiles towards Israel.
Right.
I mean, they destroyed all of the Iranian military infrastructure in Syria. And so if you imagine if they do that again, this time they're going to go after Assad's military. You go after his military, you take that off, Assad's done. he's toppled, and the Russians don't want that. But there's already an uptick in Iranian activity there.
On the cyber side.
On the cyber side because of all of this, right? So the Iranians are now getting backed into a wall. Sanctions are coming back in. Companies are starting to pull out. The Russians are letting him know, hey, you need to get out of Syria, and we'll take it from here. And we're fine with the Russians being in Syria because at least we know the evil we're dealing with. With Iran, we realize that's a corridor that is unacceptable for any national defense, including all of our allies, whether it be Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and so forth.
So you've got that whole thing going on in the Middle East, and you've got China, and China is continuing to invest in AI, machine learning, and one of the things that makes AI and all of that really powerful is the ability to have access to a lot of data. And since there is literally no privacy in China, they have access to, facial imprints and all the information on all their citizens. So they have troves of data that allows them to advance. And so some people think that with the trade, issues that might see an increase in Chinese activity, which had kind of settled down a little bit, although they still like to steal intellectual property pretty rapidly. Other people think that China will continue to focus on just building their own capability and just surpass us. And then you've got everything that's happening with North Korea. And then the Russians, they were in Houston I was in Houston just a few weeks ago with one of my regional roundtables where we bring in a lot of chief information security officers. We had a lot of folks in there from the oil and gas sector. DHS had just 2 weeks before we got there, DHS had told them that the Russians were trolling the critical infrastructure around oil and gas, not doing anything other than just taking pictures of control systems and figuring out how things work. But, we all know that the next war is not going to start with somebody dropping a bomb.
No. I watched an interview of a guy who used to be a hacker, and he said the first war, it was him and an FBI agent, and they said the first war, it'll take 6 to 9 months before a missile or a bullet is even fired or launched, because it'll be all cyber, and it'll be all just attacks on critical infrastructure, attacks on specific capabilities. We've already seen the electromagnetic attacks that now what was going on in Cuba, which we thought was the Russians, has now come out to be the Chinese. Right?
Yeah.
So the Chinese are trying this electromagnetic kind of warfare on Americans on Cuban soil, and so.
Well, just think about, people talk about, what could happen, and we talk about critical infrastructure, and certainly that's a deep concern. All we got to do is see what happened over in North Carolina after that big hurricane went through, right, and people were without electricity for weeks. I personally know that because I had a brother who lived there who was grilling food outside for 2 weeks because he had no electricity. And he was sitting in his home every night with a shotgun because there was a lot of looting going on because homes were dark at night. But also think about what just happened in the UK with the credit cards last week.
Right.
For 6 hours, nobody could use a Visa card. And Visa has, I forget what the percentage was. What was it, 60% of the market there? Something like that?
Yeah, a little bit higher.
6 out of every 10, 7 out of every 10 credit card transactions or Visa transactions in the UK. And for 6 hours, nobody could use their Visa card. You couldn't buy groceries. You couldn't check out of the hotel. I couldn't buy a train ticket. Now think about Georgia. Think about Transaction Alley. I was talking to someone the other day about, it's approaching 80% of all debit card, reward card, and credit card transactions that happen in the United States are processed between Atlanta and Columbus, Georgia. And what would happen if you could somehow interfere with that process, with that transactionality, if you could bring it down for a day or for a week?
Even for an hour.
How much cash does the average person have in their home?
Not much. We're not a cash society anymore.
We're not a cash society. So, you go to the grocery store, your credit card won't work. How are you going to buy groceries?
I went to Staples on Saturday to pick something up, and their credit card machines weren't working, and I was the only one because I had cash on me for whatever reason. I had cash on me, so I was like, hey, I'll pay cash if I can get out of here now, and just, but no one else had cash. So a line of 12, 13 people at Staples, credit card machines aren't working for whatever reason. and I'm the only one who could check out, and the line's only growing.
I have an older brother who who's very conservative, and I don't know where he keeps the cash, and won't say where he lives, but he has a fair amount of cash in his house for just this reason. Because when they had the outage down in North Carolina, a lot of companies could not process credit cards, and the only way you could buy anything was just cash.
Well, the city of Atlanta breach was the same way. You couldn't pay your bills for 2.5 weeks. You couldn't pay anything. You couldn't pay your court fees. You couldn't pay.
So talk to all the people who got their licenses suspended because they didn't pay their court fees.
Are they really still? Are they?
They were people who actually got their license suspended because they didn't pay their court fees, and they're like, but we couldn't pay our court fees, and they were like, but the process carries on because you didn't pay your court fees, you got your license suspended. I know of a couple of cases like that where it's kind of awkward. But so just think about what would happen if you could really impair critical infrastructure. I keep going back to this concept of the government's role in cyber deterrence. And I think we're moving in that direction. I think we have to have a national dialogue about what it's going to look like and how it's going to work. But I think that we've reached a point in time where we can't allow the Russians to control our critical infrastructure any longer. We just can't do it. And it's got to be consequences for companies or for nation states that either do things on their own or back back asymmetrical lone wolves. There's got to be consequences.
If you remember, in November at the summit we did, that CyberHub did in Atlanta, Oren Brett, kind of the cyber director for the Israeli military industries, he said, "Listen, guys, winter's here." And right. I've watched his lecture multiple times since because it was so on point, because everything he talked about in November has happened subsequently, right? He said, "Listen, all of our routers are infected with malware." What did the FBI come out and say yesterday? And he said, "Hey, listen, these guys they're not waiting for you to get the router. They're just in Malaysia paying someone $10,000 to install malware on every single microchip that goes into a router, because guess that's where they're made. Malaysia and Indonesia, third world countries where, a little bit of money goes a very long way for a lot of people. And most people don't know what they're doing. No different, than the assassination of Kim Jong-un's brother in the Kuala Lumpur airport, right? They thought they were part of a game show. They weren't even paid. They thought they were part of a prank game show.
Right.
I mean, this is just, and we as, critical infrastructure, you could talk about DJI and the drones and how the drone footage of our critical infrastructure that was being used by companies to survey was sitting on Chinese government servers in China, and they had literally mapped out our critical infrastructure in this country to a T.
Yeah, I think we're starting to get, a bit more concerned about component parts, and especially those that are manufactured in China.
Is this something we have to bring back to the U.S.? I mean, is this something where when you talk to your board at the NTSC, is this something where they're going, you know what, maybe it's time we start looking at more American-made. We'll pay that premium, that 20-30% extra, but at least we know we have that security peace of mind?
I don't think I've heard that conversation yet. There's a lot of conversation about software and the inherent insecurity of software.
Right.
Pete Cronus, who's on my board and who's the CISO at Turner, who just recently wrote a book called The Cyber Conundrum. Plug Pete's book. Please read it if you haven't. He talks about creating a moonshot around cyber, which I think someone at DHS stole from him, because I think there was just a hearing about having a moonshot at the congressional level. But Pete talks a lot about the security of software and the importance of trying to get a stronger perspective on developing software that's secure. Because if I'm trying to put out an app today, I can assure you that my priorities are not driven by security. My priorities are driven by getting the app out on the street on time and under budget, right? And I think that might have been one of the problems with Equifax and other companies like Equifax, who are app driven, who are digital engagement with their clients. So you want to get those apps out fast, and we can always patch it later, but it doesn't always get patched later. So I think, from a national perspective, we have to start truly thinking about how do we influence the entire software community so we start developing secure software? How do we influence key Fortune 1000, Fortune 500 companies to start using equipment that is secure? We had a situation last year where Luminance, the company, great success story here in Atlanta, where they build these digital interfaces, like a board you put on the wall, and it's all digital, and
touchscreen boards.
Yeah,
right.
Well, a touchscreen and all sorts of things, but they were bidding on a large project for the U.S. Navy, where they were putting these digital interfaces, software driven, onto U.S. ships, and the war was won by a Chinese manufacturer. And we went to a lot of congressional leaders and said, "Are you kidding me? You're going to put these devices onto U.S. naval ships, which are all driven by Chinese software. Don't you see a problem with that? Forget the procurement. I don't care if the procurement was right. Don't you see a problem with that from a security standpoint?" We didn't win. I mean, but that I think that conversation has advanced now, so that they're talking about various Chinese manufacturers being barred from any government procurement. And I think that's the right decision to protect ourselves, because we just continue to put stuff that potentially is infected into our infrastructure.
Is there a need for a global cybersecurity treaty between nation states? Like, how we had the kind of like the rules of engagement and declaring war. Do we need something similar in the cybersecurity space? Do we need a global treaty?
Someone said we need a Geneva Convention on cyber.
Right.
And I don't know if it was Pete or it was one of my board members said that to me once. And I think that's right. I think we really do need to step back and to a Geneva Convention, some kind of G20 massive, coming together and sitting down and talking about what everybody's doing. We got midterm elections coming up. If anybody thinks the Russians aren't in the process of trying to influence those, or even if they don't actually hack the voting machines, they're creating distrust in the American public in the voting process.
They've succeeded in doing that already, right?
Right.
I mean, Facebook, and we'll kind of real quick pivot, because Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg was on the Hill, and I think did you watch his testimony?
Yeah, I did. I watched a bit of it, and Mark's back in the news and probably in a bit of trouble, because apparently he lied to Congress. And then we find out that they're sharing Facebook data with several Chinese firms who love to get data because it helps them advance their AI programs and accelerate past the Americans' programs. It's
it seems like with security on our mind, right? And I talk about this quite often. There's always security on our mind, but I think the big question that always lies there is we live in a global commerce world, right? And everything is global commerce. Facebook is a global company, 1.5 billion global users. LinkedIn, owned by Microsoft, also 600 million users. Twitter is, these are all companies that have all of our personal information, location, what we like, what we don't like, what we follow, facial recognition, so many different aspects to it, but they're global and they have to play to suit, their business growth, and they employ hundreds of thousands of Americans. So do we go, hey, Facebook, you can no longer work in, China or Korea or Russia or, and even though there's alternatives, right? China, no one uses Facebook. Facebook's in fact banned in China. So there's really no reason for Facebook to have any relationship with China because they're technically banned to begin with. But how do we address global business, cybersecurity, privacy, and national security? I mean, that's a very intertwined, complex issue because you're giving something to get something.
I agree. And this is probably the only time you'll ever hear me say this, but I think we have to start with America first. I think we have to start with making sure that we're protecting ourselves initially, and are in a position to have those conversations. because it's hard to negotiate when you're extraordinarily vulnerable. You know that.
Right.
So I think we have to negotiate from a position of strength. And again, I think that if what I'm reading based on the new DHS strategy document, the new Cyber Command vision statement, remarks by Secretary Nielsen, remarks by Secretary Krebs, remarks by General Nakasone, I think you're going to see a lot more aggressive posture by the U.S. toward these nation states that are attacking us. And then that will create some level of consequence for them, whether it's economic consequence or we actually go in and, attack their infrastructure. And
Do we pull that trigger?
I'm perfectly fine with that. I suspect we're probably doing it anyway, but I think we probably are at least doing the same thing in terms of trolling. But you think about what's happened to the economy in the Ukraine in the last 3 years. Yeah. That economy has been completely devastated.
The Russians use the Ukraine as their cyber test ground.
Their cyber test ground. They've completely devastated that economy. I don't want that to happen to this country. So I want to see us get a lot more
a better posture.
The NTSC, I think, when we sit down with our chief information security officers, there are mixed views. So some of the views I've expressed today are probably Patrick Gaul's views as opposed to the NTSC. But we're in the process of figuring out what our position is going to be, our official position on cyber deterrence. We're focused very heavily on cyber threat intelligence sharing. We're working with DHS to make sure that our CISOs understand all of the capabilities that DHS can provide, and simultaneously want DHS to understand, how it's working, how AIS is working, and some of the other factors.
How does that, with the big companies, the Fortune 100, Fortune 1000, Global 1000, right? The cybersecurity, they have the CISO in place. They have cybersecurity teams, but some of these medium and small sized businesses, which are they face an attack much more often than some of those bigger companies do. What can be done to kind of bridge that gap? Because at the end of the day, the small business is what powers our economy. That's where we're most vulnerable cybersecurity wise. 6 out of 10 small businesses that go through a breach go out of business. That's no small feat. That's a very significant number, because if you think of there's a company up the street from us here that was breached, and it wasn't even a breach. It was a phishing scam that took $300,000 that emptied their bank account, essentially, took away all the operating cash flow for that business. With the owner at a conference somewhere, they ran out of office. Out of office is the worst. It's given the hacker his dream information. Hey, I'm going to be out of the office. Please reach out to this person. Now you know who to reach out to. You know their phone number, their email address, and you know the person's out of the office. So now you have this full large scale of attack. What is the NTSC trying to build a small to medium size kind of checklist or to-do list or stuff to address some of those smaller businesses down the chain?
I wouldn't say the NTSC is focused on that as much. We're really much more focused on Fortune 1000 right now. But I think there are things that, we do have Gary Nichols, who's CEO of InterDev, which is up, I think, in this area somewhere. But Gary is focused very much on small to medium enterprises. And he talks a lot about some of the things that companies can do. Certainly NIST has a lot of the framework can provide some support, but even things like Office 365 have some inherent security that's pretty darn good. So if you're a really small business, just using Office 365 will give you some security around your email. And then, looking, if you're medium sized, then I would say you should start looking at the NIST framework. I think there's a lot of structure there that you can just cut and paste and used as a guideline. So I would certainly think that medium businesses should be looking at NIST, and small businesses. Again, you made the point. 90% of all restaurants in the United States are privately owned. They're not owned by large corporations. They're privately owned, and so the average cost of a breach in the small businesses is like $50,000. that'll put a business out of, like you said, it'll put them out of business in a very short period of time if they take that kind of financial hit. So those are some of the things that they can do in the short term. At the larger end, the challenge is that there are so many vulnerabilities that they have to try and manage, and all the adversary has to do is find one of them that they didn't do well. And as I said, they're very patient. So if I'm a chief information security officer from a Fortune 1000 company, I'm waking up every day hoping I'm making the right decisions around risk assessment and around figuring out where I should invest. Hopefully, some of the things that are coming down the pike with machine learning, and I think we're still a long ways away from pure AI, but machine learning, I think, is helping to ramp up things and do some of the mundane things that better than human beings do today.
You can't take away the human factor from cybersecurity threats, right? People still open emails. People still want to work fast. People are trying to multitask. You've got, your family, your kids, your boss, your coworkers, so much stuff. People are bound to make mistakes. I mean, it's not just technology, right? Technology can't be the only solution to cybersecurity threats. There has to be an approach to people. Do you think that...
There was a great book written a few years ago called People-Centered Security. And the author provides a great example of they were doing a conference, and he was there as a consultant. And during the conference, they were at a hotel. There was a fire alert. And somebody came in and talked to the person managing the conference, and everybody got up and left the room and went outside. And that's pretty natural for a hotel or an office building. Fire alarm goes off. That's just second nature to us. But when they came back, somebody had found one of the very proprietary packages that the attendees were looking at, financials and everything, sitting on the table for anybody to pick up and walk out. So that's a breach of security. But there really wasn't. He said, as a consultant observing this, he said, there wasn't a lot of backlash about that, right? So the way I think about it is, if we both spend time in New York City, if you're walking down the street in Brooklyn, 9 o'clock at night, you're not in a neighborhood you don't know very well, every instinct in that small brain in the back of our heads is on alert. That
right.
Flee or fight instinct. We spy somebody across. We see things that we would never even notice if we were driving in the car, but we're completely alert, right? Because we know we're vulnerable. Why don't we have that same level of instinct when we engage cyber? Why don't we have this national sense of only you can prevent a breach?
Well, do you think most and I hate to say this, but do you think most Americans are complacent? We hear about breaches all the time. Equifax, Chase, so many of them, Home Depot, and I mean you can go on. And now MyHeritage, right? 92 million people hacked, their DNA stolen as part of that breach. Do you think we're just immune to it? We're like, my information's out there already. I don't care anymore.
I think that there is a strong perspective around that, and especially around millennials who fundamentally share everything at the drop of a hat. I have a 20-year-old and a 22-year-old, and they have no sense of privacy. I assure you, none. The things they tell people on Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat are just things that we would never dream of having done when I was a younger lad. But remember the only you can prevent forest fires, only you can prevent wildfires. That was the most popular, and it's still running today. I mean, it's the most popular.
Smokey the Bear.
Smokey the Bear. And it got a message across about how we have to be aware of what we're doing when we're in our forest, because only we could prevent forest fires, only we could prevent wildfires. Why don't we have a campaign that's similar, nationwide campaign to educate people about, understanding that email that looks like it came from the one I was telling you about before we got started from USAA that I got this morning, the day after I had been logged in, changing some parameters on my insurance cover, my auto coverage. Not just saying, oh, well, I was there yesterday, they must have sent me a message, but looking at it closely enough to realize that that's not really a USAA email. There's enough in there. And if you just click on the from and figure out who sent it, typically the address will tell you it's not from USAA.
Right. It'll be USAAA.
Yeah, or it'll be, ZY10 something. But we have to be more circumspect. I mean, ransomware has become the most profitable malware globally in just over 2 years, right? And how does malware get delivered? It gets delivered through phishing emails.
Right.
And people clicking on links. And people clicking on links that if they just stood back and thought for a second and said, does this really make sense? Is this really from my boss? Do I need to think about it? Do I need to be more cautious? I'm walking down the street in New York. Does that guy across the street pose a threat? Does that email pose a threat? Most cyber hygiene is not rocket science. Most
Right.
cyber hygiene is just doing the mundane things really, really better than we're doing them today.
I find it fascinating when you hear about the human interaction with a computer, right? I mean, you see it with phishing emails and ransomware, and you gave a great example of ransomware being the most profitable, I mean, it's literally the most profitable method to gain anything today, right? For hackers. I mean, it's the simplest way to get in, but ransomware is now more advanced. I mean, ransomware now, with the city of Atlanta at least, encrypted the backup files within the network because they were able to map the whole network. They had so much time, which is, my guess is with your USAA email, someone's already in their network. They've got it all mapped out, and they're just using you to try to infiltrate now your user account through that, right? How do you address that? I mean, again, this kind of falls onto the company, right? This falls on, but is there can you pass a law that says, oh, you have to protect against these specific aspects? Because, earlier you spoke about breach notification and then, posture and deterrence, right? And we spoke about U.S. Cyber Command and the role of government and so forth. But this is a classic example of, you're a government like the city of Atlanta or, USAA. Do we need to whose responsibility eventually should it fall onto? Because eventually it's going to fall on the CISO, right? So who can we point the finger to and say, we can't have this just continuing to go on? How do we find these breaches? Should that be a government decision? Should that be a private business decision? I mean, what I'm trying to get to, and the bottom line of my question is, who's responsible at the end of the day for the security of the customer, vendor, employee data? Should it be something that the company should be responsible for? Should it be something that the federal government should require a responsible body to be there?
Complicated question.
I know.
I think we all have responsibility. So if I'm in a company, and I have a lot of access to my consumers' data, people who shop in my stores, or whether I'm Dollar Tree or I'm whoever, JCPenney. I want to make sure that I'm protecting that information, but I've got to make sure that everybody in the company understands that it's their job to do the same thing. So that's got to be a mindset throughout the entire corporation, that security is important, just like safety is important, just like sexual harassment is a key issue that the companies focus on to make sure that doesn't happen in their corporations. Why can't security be on the same level with all of those things?
Who's doing it right? Who have you seen that's really got security up there with sexual harassment, with safety? Let's talk about a positive.
Well, I think some of the large banks are doing it really well. Clearly, they recognize how vulnerable they are, given the data that they're protecting. I think large banks are probably doing it as well as anybody out there to now. I think companies like Discover Financial Services, MasterCard, U.S. Bank, Huntington Bank, I think they're all doing it pretty well. They're certainly not, you know, invulnerable. I mean, they're being attacked constantly. I mean, I've talked to some of my financial services board members, and the number of attacks that they get in a single day is astounding. But they seem to be doing it well. I think retailers are struggling because a lot of them are small mom and pop companies, and security is costly, and they can't always afford it. I think healthcare is really struggling right now. Yeah, I would say big banks are probably doing it as well as anybody out there today.
Finally, NTSC, you guys have your annual conference in DC in July. Tell us a little bit about that.
We're really excited about that. That'll start on the 16th of July. We'll be at the Jones Day corporate headquarters on Capitol Hill, which is a beautiful facility that the Chief Information Security Officer of Jones Day is on our board of directors and negotiated that for us. So they're going to host the event in their executive conference suite. We'll have a VIP reception and a dinner on the evening of the 16th. And then on the 17th, we'll have our National Policy Conference. And we've got a pretty good lineup of speakers. We'll have folks from ODNI, we'll have folks from NSA, we'll have folks from DHS, we'll have folks from congressional leaders will be there. The Chief Technology Officer for Juniper Networks will be one of our keynote speakers, Bikesh Kohli, who moved to Juniper last summer from Google, and he built all of the data centers in Google. He's a pretty fascinating guy. He's going to talk about multi-cloud and some of the policy implications associated with multi-cloud. We've got General Kevin McLaughlin, who is the former Deputy Director of U.S. Cyber Command, who's on our advisory board. He's going to do a fireside chat with Suzanne Kelly from the Cypher Brief. She's the CEO and publisher of the Cypher Brief about, guess what, the role of government in cyber deterrence. Who else but General McLaughlin retired last August, so he hasn't been gone long. So we're excited about that lineup. So that'll be that's an invitation only event designed to have Chief Information Security Officers and other Chief Technology Security Executives. So your title may be VP Information Security or something like that. Also, we'll be inviting some CIOs and some CTOs. We reckon there'll probably be between 100 and 150 guests on the day. We try and keep it intentionally small. We're not trying to do an RSA type of event. We think that the smaller we have it, the more intimate, the more chance for dialogue. It's no media, it's completely redacted. No, nobody's going to get quoted. So it's a lot of opportunity for good open dialogue. And then finally, on the 18th, we'll spend the entire day on the Hill meeting with congressional leaders, bringing the voice of the Chief Information Security Officer to their offices, talking about things like cyber threat intelligence sharing, talking about national data breach notification legislation, talking about the encryption debate, which has suddenly surfaced again. We didn't touch on that today, but suddenly that's becoming a really hot topic. I don't know if you saw the announcement this morning by Australia and some of the rules that they're about to implement in terms of forcing companies to give access to encrypted data. I think that's going to be really challenging.
To give government access to encrypted data?
To give government access to encrypted data, forcing companies in Australia to give government access to encrypted data.
For what purpose?
Like the shooting in California. I'm trying to break into the iPhone. I'm trying to get encrypted data because there's a criminal investigation. That debate kind of surfaces every time there's an incident, like we had in California, and then it kind of dies down, and then it comes back and it dies down. But Congressman Mike McCall and Senator Mark Warner wrote a paper 2 years ago called Going Dark, Going Forward. And they called for a national debate on this issue. And, it's not a black and white solution because there are a lot of shades to it. But we really do have to figure out what we're going to do. I know Attorney General Sessions has a very strong viewpoint, and some of my board members probably share that viewpoint, especially some of my board members who have three-letter acronyms behind their names in terms of their careers. But there are other board members who feel that we should never have any backdoors. But we've got to have that debate and figure out how we're gonna fix that. So we're going to talk a bit to some of the congressional leaders about that. We're going to talk about workforce development, another important issue in this country. We don't have enough cyber students. If every university in the country started graduating, full classes, we're still going to be critically short over the next few years. How can we address that? Not everybody needs a four-year degree. What can some of our technical college do to get people back on track? How can we leverage people getting out of the military, et cetera?
Well, I think Dr. Lee from Georgia Tech mentioned that at the dinner last year for CyberHub, where he said it takes a Georgia Tech student 18 months after he graduates from their InfoSec school to even be viable for a company in terms of what they need him to do, even at the most basic levels. And
that's true. I mean, Helen Patton, who's the Chief Information Security Officer at Ohio State, says that, depending on the student, you might be able to do it shorter, but the average I've heard is 12 to 18 months. And we've actually been working with Georgia Tech. We brought in a group of board members, sat down and talked to them about their curriculum, talked to them about the needs, what are some of the things that the school can be doing to help truncate that, some of the skill sets that they could be helping to instill that probably aren't getting across today, especially communication skills, the ability to talk about what you do in speak other than technology speak, to put it in business speak, so that a board member or a senior vice president will understand why this investment is important. I think Georgia Tech is one of the top schools, especially at the graduate level. We just recently worked with the University of Texas at San Antonio, has probably the top undergraduate program.
Well, San Antonio, hands down, has cyber right as a city.
Right.
I mean, they've done it right. They've built it right. They educate it right. You don't go to San Antonio and not feel safe, cyber-wise at least.
Yeah. The professor who spoke at our conference in Houston was from UTSA, and he talked about an experiment they did where they created a honeypot. They actually created a fake community where they had the sheriff's department, the water department, the tax office, created this whole community, but they did it in a honeypot. And he was showing us the number of hits they had with people attacking that honeypot within the first 24 hours, and how many of them came from China, and how many of them came from Iran, how many of them came from Russia, and it was astounding. But they do fun things, and that was a graduate student project that they carried on for several years.
That to me is when I was in San Antonio, it was fascinating for me to see just how well they're doing it. And in fact, talking locally here, we kind of told the folks in Augusta, we go, hey, you guys should really take like a week-long tour of San Antonio and kind of see how they did it as a community. Because one of my concerns with Augusta, with the White Lawn, U.S. Cyber Command, and the new cyber range that Governor Deal has put in, is how is the community there going to react? Because now it becomes a target. You have people who live there and are part of that community that have TSSIs. These people still go out to eat dinner. These people still go to dry cleaners, coffee shops. How do you as a community start to become more aware of that, Greek new restaurant owner, who's not really Greek, right? We've seen cases of that in different parts. That was a case in Virginia, early on was, you would see a lot of, the agents that come in that are immigrants that are, there to be a pillar of the community, join the chamber, become part of it, but they're really just there to kind of try to dissect and find information. How do you, and San Antonio has all these different trainings that they do to the community there, which are excellent, which is kind of helping, structure people to, be more aware. And, what I'm looking forward to is seeing how Augusta's gonna.
It's going to be
take
interesting.
that
I think
challenge on.
Augusta has some great business leaders. They do, and there's the Technology Association Georgia has a strong presence down there with a good strong board. I know Larry, the president of TAG, Larry Williams, was just down there recently talking to them. But I don't think the average person in Augusta probably understands what's happening in their community. When I go down, you and I were talking about this earlier. We both go down to the Army Cyber Warfare School, which is the classes are housed in the NSA facility. And if you've not been through the vetting process to get into the NSA facility, it's a pretty secure facility, and you don't walk in, with anything on you. I don't even take a pen into the room. I mean, certainly no electronic devices, no fobs, no anything. And you've gone through a lot of background check before you even get in. And you go through that background check every single time I go down there. I have to go through a background check. Not just, hey, I did one last week or 7 weeks ago. No, we're going to do another one, because we want to make sure that in the last 7 weeks nothing's happened, nothing's changed. But I don't think the average person in Augusta understands what's going to happen. And once the Cyber Academy gets going, the Cyber Range gets going, once completion of movement of U.S. Cyber Command and U.S. Army Command, all of that starts ramping up, I think they'll see it, because the infrastructure is going to be hit with the number of new cars and people, and so I think they've got
Right,
some
and
challenge.
how do you dissect which people are the good guys and which people are pretending to be good, but are really there to try to infiltrate some of our good guys?
Yeah, and Augusta is consistently ranked as one of the top places to retire, right? So they're constantly looking, great medical facilities there, great. Most people don't realize that if you're over the age, I think it's either 60 or 65. I think it's 60. If you're 60 or older, you can sit in on any college course in any university in the state of Georgia for free.
I should get a fake driver's license.
Yeah.
I mean, my white hair, I can get through with it.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty amazing. And there's a lot of opportunity for older folks. I mean, you ride the bus for free in Augusta if you're over 60. You can go to all of these college classes. There's great medical support there for older people. It's a great city to retire in. I love Augusta, but
I don't know how many of those folks are going to stick around, though, with all the development that's going on there. It's going to get a little hectic.
It's going to grow rapidly. I mean, it's one of the fastest growing counties in the entire country today. But like I said, they have great business leaders. So I think that they have a handle on what they're facing. I think they'll do a great job.
Awesome. Well, Patrick, thanks for coming. We are at the hour mark, so we've been going at it for quite some time. Doesn't feel like it.
It's been fun. Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
So just want to remind our guests, the NTSC. So if you're a CISO, VP of BizDev, they can go to ntsc.org.
You can go to ntsc.org. Yes.
And apply if you want to take part of the NTSC. Patrick, thanks for being here. Good luck in DC. And this is the Cyber Hub Engage podcast. We'll be right back after these messages. The Cyber Hub Engage podcast is brought to you by CyberHub Summit. CyberHub Summit is the leading executive cybersecurity education forum, hosting their second annual event in Atlanta, Georgia on October 10th. You can find out more at cyberhubsummit.com. Hey everyone, and we're back. I want to thank Patrick Gaul for being in the studio with us. I hope you found this podcast to be really interesting. I'm excited. I'll probably be at Patrick's NTSC conference, and if I'm there, I'll try to get some of those guys to do a few episodes with us if they're willing to. Although because it's like Patrick said off the record, I'm not sure. No press. And I'm not really pressed, but still, again, we do this podcast, so that is considered press. So I want to thank you for tuning in. Please follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter at CyberHub Engage. If you have any topics you want us to discuss, anything like that, we'd love to hear from you. The month of July is going to be all about cyberbullying and protecting your kids as we get our kids in July ready for back to school. So we'll have a bunch of episodes talking about that for you parents out there, aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, who have a little one who obviously has a smart device and is exposed to a lot of people who take advantage of that innocence and naivety. So we hope to be able to help you address those coming up in July and August. Next week, we have a great guest on our show, Wes Knight. He's the CISO for the Georgia Department of Revenue, and we'll be interviewing him directly from his office. So we're very excited about that. So make sure you subscribe and download. Listen, we'll be back next week with West Knight. I want to thank Patrick Gaul for being on the show today. Our technical director is Micah Smith. My name is James Azar, and this is the CyberHub Engage podcast. Thanks for tuning in.